Hey there, Trinity. If you're watching me right now, that means there was a problem and I wasn't able to join you live. That would be too bad. So hopefully you never see this. But if you do, I hope that it's edifying to you. I'm coming to you live, complete with my COVID-compliant hair, from the UK, where we've just entered a brand new invented tier of lockdown, Tier 4, the strictest lockdown that has existed thus far, which will continue across Christmas time. Interesting times. Anyway, because of the fact that this is the week that during Advent season we light the love candle, I'm going to be sharing about love. And I want to start with a question. Why does love even exist at all? In a sense, the molecules, atoms, protons, neutrons, electrons, even the quarks that the stuff of the physical universe is made up of do not require love in order to materially exist. So bear with me on this because it will get rather up in the sky theoretical before it gets back down to earth. And I want to make 3 observations about love before we begin. Firstly, as a verb, love is transitive. And this means that for love to be love, one has to love someone or something. One can't just love. Second of all, for love to be love, it has to be costly. You will not find a convenient definition or a technical definition of love in the Bible. However, you can read a pretty good description of what love looks like in 1 Corinthians 13, where Paul introduces it as a more excellent way. So if love bears all things and endures all things, as it says, then it will inevitably be costly. Third observation, in order to be love, it has to be willing to accept risk and it has to involve vulnerability because love must be chosen. You cannot force someone to love you. Love must always involve choice. In order to be free to choose to love, a person also has to have the choice not to love. And leaving it to the choice of another means being vulnerable and assuming risk. So the idea of an all-powerful God accepting risk and vulnerability might not rest easy with you in your idea of God. But then, when you read in the prophets of God's agony, his emotion over Israel's waywardness and idolatry, you realize how much God's own love renders him vulnerable to being rejected and heartbroken. In the words of C.S. Lewis, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or the coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. That's from C.S. Lewis's 4 Loves. So back to the question, why does love exist at all? Well, the best explanation that why love exists at all is, to me, borne out through the historicity of the incarnation as we celebrate it during this Advent season. It is because God is love. In fact, I am of the persuasion that all of humanity, indeed the whole created universe, exists exactly because God is love. And for us as people to realize this, to know it, Christ had to be born. Now I need to step back and try to explain a little bit about the nature of God and the universe in light of the centrality of love. And it all boils down to the idea that there are three possible ways to explain how our universe works. So the first one is naturalism, the idea that there is no God. Humans are the product of randomness and chance. When we die, we cease to exist altogether. All morality is subjective because there is no overarching meaning or purpose. Pantheism is another option. And that basically comes down to the idea that God is everything and in everything, and everything is part of God and God. It's an impersonal oneness encompassing all of reality. But reality itself is an illusion, and the distinctions between God and God's creation are also an illusion. That's another option. That's the essence of Hinduism and Jainism and sort of Buddhism. And polytheism, the idea of multiple gods, well, that ultimately boils down to one of those two views above, but I won't get into the details of that. And then there's the third option, theism. An infinitely perfect and personal God necessarily exists. God created the universe, but is distinct from it. And morality is real because it is based in the character of a theistic personal God. Now, in which of these three cosmic worldviews does actual love fit in or make sense or have a reason? There are, I admit, there are a lot of problems, or at least very hard questions, with a worldview where a loving, sovereign God exists and yet evil and suffering also exist. A lot of problems harmonizing those realities. But I see that there are even more numerous and more difficult problems with a worldview where no God exists at all and where there are no objective values and there is no purpose or reason to anything in existence. That's a harder worldview for me to accept as likely than the Christian worldview. So remember again that love is a transitive verb. It means you cannot love. You must love someone or something. And as a result, even in theism, a raw, bare, cold, monotheistic entity who existed before time and outside of creation cannot be love because there was no one and nothing to love before creation existed. Such a being would be, it'd be more like a cosmic, omnipotent block of ice. Take, for example, the God in whom our Muslim friends believe, as revealed through the Quran. I looked every instance of the word love in the Quran, and this is taken from the verses, the surahs of the Quran. Allah loves the charitable, the repentant, the pious, the doers of good, the equitable, the trusting, the righteous, those who purify themselves, those who fight in his cause. And that's it. It's all that Allah loves, nothing else. It also says that Allah does not love the aggressor, any sinful ingrate, the faithless, the unjust, the evildoers, the arrogant show-off, the deceitful sinner, the corrupters, the wasteful, the excessive, any ungrateful traitor, the exultant, the unjust, and the proud snob. And that's all. So, have you ever been in a relationship that is based on your behavior determining whether or not someone loves you? Not a very healthy relationship to be in. And it's interesting that nowhere, in the Quran at least, is Allah stated to love the world or to love all mankind, never mind to actually be love. And this is in clear contrast to the God that's revealed in the Bible. What's the most well-known verse in the New Testament that every Sunday school kid can probably recite? John 3:16. For God so loved the world. In Romans 5:8, we read that God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God's love for us is not determined by our behaviors. We know that Jesus is not just sent from God, but according to Hebrews 1, the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. Colossians 1 says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, distinct from the Father, and yet the perfect representation of him. And this is a huge part of why a triune God is necessary for love to be a foundation of our own faith. Love requires relationship, and only a God who is three in one can be in an eternally pre-existing relationship. Only a God that is intrinsically and essentially in relationship can be a God who is love. That cosmic block of ice cannot be love. And because God is love, everything that he does will be a manifestation and an expression of his love, creating the universe. Humanity was done because God wants to express his love and share it. Humanity was created as an act of God's love, and we exist in order to receive, enjoy, be blessed by, share in, and convey God's love. So all of this leads me to the incarnation. The incarnation was a necessity. First of all, without Jesus being born, he could not have done his public ministry. He could not have established his authority over sickness and unclean spirits. He could not have endured the false accusations and a sham trial, nor endured the shame and the torture of the cross and death. Nor could he have been resurrected, reconciling man to God and triumphing over death. He could not have ascended to the right hand of the Father to rule with all authority in heaven and on earth, and eventually return to make all things right again and to restore all of creation to its intended function forever. For all of that to happen, he obviously first had to have been born. Everything and anything positive and good of what will endure for eternity can only come to pass because of the incarnation of Christ being born as a baby. The second reason why incarnation was a necessity is because we as humans are relational in nature because we bear an image of God, and because we're limited in our capacity to understand and appreciate the things that are beyond us. In order for us to truly see and understand and know love, God had to reveal it at our level through a relationship with us, namely, expressed in Jesus Christ. A giant floating head appearing out of the sky and saying, "Hear me, people of earth, love me, for I am love," would not do the trick. So I'm reminded, actually, of that possibly fictional and possibly cheesy, but definitely relevant story of the farmer who skipped out on the Christmas service that his family went to in the midst of a very wintry weather. And he heard a banging against his window, and when he went to look, he saw that small birds had been caught up in this cold weather and had flown into the window, as birds kind of do, and they were stunned in the snow there. And so he went outside to try and help them out. And they were really struggling, and they'd been caught in this storm. And so he went over to the barn. He opened the barn door where it was warm and safe and sheltered inside, and he tried to shoo them in, and they wouldn't respond. And then he laid out a trail of crumbs in order to entice them in, and they wouldn't follow it. They were still so discombobulated by the window and the cold. And finally he tried to catch them, and they always tried to flitter away from him. And the farmer thought to himself, if only I could become a bird so I could speak to them. They're afraid of me, and I have to become one of them so that they can see and hear and understand me. And that's, according to the story, when he heard the Christmas bells ringing and the realization hit him. In order for us to know that God is love, the incarnation was a necessity. Well, in the words of Nacho Libre, so anyway, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. I love that film. You got to watch it. Anyway, how do we get from these high concepts of love to the personal implications of love? And dare I say, the communal implications of love. It was the great American theologian and revivalist Jonathan Edwards who wrote the following. In 1 Corinthians 13, we observe that something is spoken of as of special importance and as peculiarly essential in Christians, which the apostle calls agape. And this agape, we find, is abundantly insisted on in the New Testament by Christ and by his apostles, more insisted on indeed than any other virtue. The very locus, the center of Christian conduct is love. Jesus himself said it. In Matthew 22, one of the Pharisees, an expert in the law, tested him with this question, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Paul said likewise in Galatians 5:14, "For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself." And in Ephesians 5:1-2, "Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." And John writes in chapter 13 of his gospel, "A new commandment I give to you," in the words of Jesus, "that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another." And here's the clincher. "By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." And then in the next chapter, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. I am giving you these commands so that you may love one another." And then in the epistles of John, he writes, "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us." Remember, love is costly. "And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters." Later in the same epistle, "Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins." And then finally, "If anyone says, 'I love God,' and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him: whoever loves God must also love his brother." It doesn't get any more practical than that. Now, that's not from 1 John, that's from me. This is all about our response to God's love manifested in the incarnation, the Christ child born as we celebrate at Christmas. This is about obedience to God's commands, as John repeated over and over. It's about putting the needs of others before ourselves. It's about laying our lives down for the sake of someone else. As a missionary, I have to say, it is about our testimony to an onlooking world. So when I see a feuding body of Christ, deeply divided, I see not only the hurt that it causes to our God, but the terrible witness that it is to the world. And it's why I'm so grieved at the divisions in the church, most notably these days in the U.S., sad to say. And it's a U.S. theologian, Greg Boyd, who explains judgment as the opposite of love. And this framework helps us understand why the deep division that many in the church have and that exists in so many societies is so damaging. Boyd maintains that love can be understood as esteeming and honoring the other person at your own expense, and judgment, on the other hand, is esteeming and honoring yourself at the other person's expense. Furthermore, he says, I honestly don't believe we'll even begin to move in the right direction until we resolve that loving one another and everyone else is a higher priority than proving, protecting, or enforcing the rightness of our doctrines. Love has to be the bottom line, the first thing. Now, as you may know, Boyd is a contemporary of ourselves and not infrequently a controversial theologian. So let's rewind 1,600 years back to one of the most respected and influential theologians of all time, St. Augustine of Hippo. And according to Augustine, he says, or he wrote, "Whoever thinks that he understands the Holy Scriptures or any part of them, but puts such an interpretation on them that does not tend to build up the twofold love of God and of our neighbor, does not yet understand them as he ought." Let me read that again. "Whoever thinks he understands the Holy Scriptures or any part of them, but puts such an interpretation on them that does not tend to build up the twofold love of God and of our neighbor, does not yet understand them as he ought." They just don't get it. And no more needs to be said. Okay. Now, at this point, just imagine that I've stopped talking. Imagine that. And that someone else is coming to share a testimony, and that someone just happens to also be me. So here I am. And I am sharing a testimony, of course, on this day about love. And a little explaining probably needs to happen first. As you've just discovered, I love concepts. And I love people as concepts. I love ideas. And I love the idea of God. But do I love God, the person? This is a question I must keep asking myself. Well, I also love the concept and the idea of love. But if God is love, and if Jesus is an exact representation of God, and if we, his followers, are called to keep on becoming like Jesus until one day when we are made completely like him, then my ultimate goal, ultimate destination is to also be love. That is, for it to be so essential to my nature that without it, I am no longer who I am. And I confess that means I've still got a long road to walk. None of us are there yet. So there are 3 stages of my own life, or parts of my story, that I want to share about that relate to love. And the first was the story around my own surrender of my life to God. I had been a Sunday school kid, and so as a teenager, I already knew the concepts of God, the idea of divine love. I wasn't following God, and I wasn't interested in God. Love, in the sense of the word, as I shared earlier, was not really a part of my life at all. I was as selfish and manipulative and unempathetic a person as I knew. And interestingly, I tried to find an antonym or an opposite to empathetic instead of unempathetic, and the best I could come up with was either apathetic or sociopathic. Probably prefer the former than the latter. So anyway, there's me, the teenager who did not love God and was not interested in God as a person at all. And then I got dragged to this Christian summer camp against my will, kicking and screaming, well, not really, the whole way. And I was exposed to people there for whom that kind of biblical love was a part of their life. And even though I still sort of resented being there, I was at least stimulated by the Bible teacher that week. He was very sharp. He was a good communicator. He had some cool things to say. But what impacted me far more was the love that I saw in other young people who were there. First of all, it was during the times of musical worship. I could see these were people who really loved God, and they were not interested in a concept. They were worshiping a person with whom they were truly in a relationship. And I knew that was absent from me when I looked at them. And then second, so many of them actually loved one another with a love that looked a lot like their love for God. They are caring for one another, esteeming one another, not judging one another, being honest and open, treating a newcomer like myself with kindness. The cool kids hanging out with the not cool kids because coolness didn't matter. So seeing how people who had been transformed by the love of God lived and related, it convinced me that this whole Christianity lark was not just a set of antiquated but respectable philosophical ideas, but it was a relationship based on love. And I invited that love in, or I should say I responded to God's initiative for my life to be transformed. And it was an example of God's relentless pursuit of me, the kind of pursuit that only comes from someone who truly knows what love is. God, that is. My own disinterest and selfishness would have dissuaded anyone else, but not God. Now, the second episode, like any good trilogy, has its darker side. So, fast forward by 20 plus years, maybe. Somehow, I had reached a point where, let me go back. I'd been serving in mission for a number of years by then, 15 years, more than 15, and in a ministry based here in the UK that was a perfect fit for my gifts and my talents and my temperament. And my work was having a real impact on the world, and I was a name. And yet at some point, and it happened subtly as it often does, I lost sight of my first love. And if there was love in my life at that time, it would have been more about my love of self, maybe or probably my love for the work that I did and the significance that it had. And as a result of losing my way like that, I made a lot of unwise or bad choices that didn't look at all like me loving God or loving my neighbor. I ended up burnt out spiritually, emotionally, and otherwise. And when I look back, I'm tempted to just cringe at my own selfishness and my own lack of love. And as a result of all of that accumulating, I had to step out of ministry for a pretty good while. It was a major shock to the system, and my world kind of came tumbling down for a while. And this touches on something that actually Mary Ann shared about last week, that identity and where our identity lies. Somehow I had got to this point where I was seeing my identity no longer in Christ, but in myself and what I did and what I accomplished. And when all of that was taken away, my life kind of came apart. But God didn't abandon me, even though he had every right to do so, bringing so much dishonor to him. Instead of discarding me as a son of disobedience who is gratifying my own sinful cravings and deserving of wrath, as Ephesians 2 says, he demonstrated once again his relentless love. 1 Corinthians 13 all over again. It was a love that did not dishonor me, nor was it easily angered with me. It was a love that kept no record of wrongs. He reminded me that I was his son, even if wayward for a season, and that my identity was fundamentally not based on what I did or did not do. His love was not determined by my behaviors, but my identity was based on the fact that I had been adopted into his family. Many of you will have heard me preach on adoption before. The reason I often do so, and I try to as much as I can, is because it is a way of explaining our salvation that touches deeply both on God's unwavering love for us and on our own new identity that has been initiated and completed by him. So, third installment is more recent. It's come about during the 2020 season of global pandemic, upheaval, uncertainty. It has been a really up and down year for me. In terms of my external circumstances, at least. Internally, better than that. Potentially some more big dips in the road ahead in the next several weeks. We'll see. But I had the opportunity to take a very restful and yet very adventurous sabbatical for a few months. Nowhere have I felt the joy and the wonder of a loving creator more than on a mountaintop in Scotland on my birthday or along the rugged Cornish coast this past summer. I've essentially been homeless, or at least nomadic, for most of this year. I've managed to publish another book, but have also been confronted with huge challenges in my ministry. I've had 4 injuries, 2 of which will probably require surgery at some point. But I've also been in the best shape of the last 20 years. I've had precious time away with the Lord amidst his creation, but I've also had to fight against getting pulled into some very un-Christ-like debates and attitudes and exchanges due to some differing philosophies in global ministry context this year because of COVID, because of political turmoil. I've had to tease apart in my own mind and heart and spirit so many disruptive ideas with destructive implications that have come about because of the pandemic and because of some thinking in the church. And yet I've gained a new compassion and a new empathy for those who are suffering through no fault of their own. I've watched the Western church get distracted by really silly things, while our brothers and sisters in places like Yemen and Mozambique and Syria and elsewhere are suffering terribly for their faith. I've had opportunities to be really stretched and to grow in my life as a disciple. Some of them I've stepped into well, and some of them I have not. But all in all, I've seen and I felt God's relentless love for me as his adopted son, determining my identity, and also God's relentless love for his church, his people, and indeed for the whole world. And sometimes it feels like we're doing our very best as Christians, or even as a human race, to make a mess of things. We're hell-bent on destruction, self-destruction. And yet God keeps loving us, and he keeps winning people to himself through the very same love that brought Christ to earth as an infant. Even more profound, the birth of Jesus was not a reaction by God in response to things getting out of control or getting out of his hands. The three-in-one God preemptively, proactively chose this route from the foundation of the world as the most loving, most godlike, most perfect way to demonstrate to fallen humanity that he is love, reconciling the world to himself through Christ. And it takes me back one more time to that timeless truth in 1 Corinthians, the truths that have transformed and keep transforming me, and that are able to transform the whole world. And that love is patient, love is kind, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. And so, as disciples of that loving God, as we love one another, let's focus on that incredible love incarnated in the Christ child as we celebrate this Advent Sunday. God bless you.